You've wandered into the perfect place for some spine-tingling tales that will keep you on edge tonight. We're diving deep into 3 unsettling mysteries that you won't be able to shake off anytime soon. Expect chills, unexpected twists, and the kind of suspense that'll make you second-guess every creak and shadow you encounter. Before we get into it, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. And let me know in the comments. What's the creepiest experience you've ever had? Let's see how your stories stack up against what's in store for you here. All right, let's get into it. Buckle up. It's going to be a bumpy ride. The Rusted Men. I'd been a harbor patrol officer in Charleston for the better part of 10 years. Nothing about it was glamorous. My nights were spent navigating the marshes, the long stretches of silent water, checking for stranded boats or broken-down engines. A lot of nothing, mostly. It was peaceful in its own way until you saw something that didn't make sense. My name is Officer Glenn Carter, and last month I found something I wish I hadn't. It started with a radio call, a distress signal from an old ship that had long been written off the records. The Carolina Breeze, a cargo vessel that was decommissioned 2 decades ago. She'd been left to rust at a scrapyard upstate. How her call came through again? Well, that's where this story begins. It was late when the message came through. I was working the night shift, the air humid and still, when the crackle of an old radio frequency cut through the silence. At first I thought it was static, but then I heard the voice, a man's voice, garbled and faint, repeating the ship's name and position. "This is the Carolina Breeze. We need assistance. Anyone receiving, please respond." I nearly dropped the radio. The Carolina Breeze had been scrapped in '94. No crew, no captain, just a rusting heap that had been torn apart for scrap. But the coordinates were clear. It was out there, somewhere in the harbor, asking for help. I took the patrol boat out, navigating through the maze of marshy channels, the beam of my spotlight cutting through the fog. I wasn't expecting to find much. Maybe just a hoax, someone playing a trick on the harbor patrol. But when I reached the coordinates, my stomach dropped. There she was, the Carolina Breeze looming out of the mist, her hull covered in rust, her masts half collapsed, leaning to one side like a ship that had been forgotten by time. I pulled the boat alongside her, heart pounding in my chest. The ship was silent. No lights, no signs of life, just the steady creak of metal groaning in the breeze. I called out, but no one answered. It didn't make sense. The ship had been decommissioned. It shouldn't be floating out here, let alone broadcasting a distress signal. But I had to know what was going on. I had to see for myself. Climbing aboard, the first thing that hit me was the smell. Metallic, like rust and seawater, but heavier, more suffocating. The deck was slick with moisture, the wood rotting beneath my boots. Every step felt unstable, like the ship was waiting for the right moment to sink. I made my way toward the bridge, the air thick with an unnatural quiet. As I passed the cargo holds, I noticed something strange. The walls were covered in rust, but it wasn't the usual corrosion. The rust seemed alive. It pulsed like it was spreading in real time, creeping across the metal in thin, spider-like veins. When I reached the bridge, I found the radio. It was old, outdated, the kind of equipment that hadn't been used in decades. But it was still on, still broadcasting that same faint distress signal. "This is the Carolina Breeze. We need assistance." I picked up the receiver, my hand shaking. "This is Officer Glenn Carter with Charleston Harbor Patrol. Who am I speaking with?" The radio crackled for a moment, then went silent. And then I heard it, a soft shuffle like footsteps coming from the lower deck. I grabbed my flashlight and moved toward the sound, descending into the lower levels of the ship. The air down there was worse, thick with the stench of decay, and the rust was everywhere, crawling across the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. It felt like the ship was dying, like something was eating away at it from the inside. That's when I saw them. 3 men, huddled in the corner of the engine room, their backs turned to me. They were wearing old, tattered uniforms, the kind sailors used to wear decades ago. But something was wrong. Their skin was pale, almost gray, and their hair hung in thin, matted clumps. "Hey," I called out, my voice echoing through the room. "Are you the crew? What's going on here?" Slowly, one of them turned to face me, and I took a step back, the breath catching in my throat. His skin wasn't just pale, it was rusted. Patches of metal seemed to be growing out of him, his flesh merging with the ship, his eyes dull and lifeless. The veins of rust I'd seen on the walls were spreading across his body, like some kind of infection twisting through his skin, pulling him apart. "We need help," he croaked, his voice weak and broken. "We can't leave." I backed away, panic rising in my chest. The other two men turned to me then, their bodies in the same horrifying state, rust growing through their skin like they'd become part of the ship. One of them tried to stand, but his legs buckled and he collapsed onto the floor with a sickening crack. "What happened to you?" I whispered, my hands trembling as I held the flashlight. "We stayed too long," the first man rasped. "The ship, it's taking us. It's feeding." I didn't understand what he meant, but I didn't need to. I had to get out of there. Whatever was happening on that ship, whatever had turned those men into, whatever they were, it wasn't natural. It wasn't right. I turned and bolted for the deck, the sound of the men's wheezing breaths echoing behind me. As I reached the top, I heard one last, desperate plea. "Help us!" I stumbled back onto the patrol boat, the ship looming over me like a rotting carcass. I gunned the engine and sped away, not daring to look back until the Carolina breeze was nothing but a silhouette in the mist. Back on shore, I reported what I'd seen, but no one believed me. They sent out a search team, but when they reached the coordinates, the ship was gone. The Carolina breeze had vanished. I don't know where that ship went or what happened to the men aboard her, but I can still feel it. That creeping rust, that suffocating smell. It's been weeks, and every night I dream of the ship, adrift in the mist waiting for its next victim. Sometimes when I'm alone, I hear the sound of the radio, just a faint crackle, whispering through the static. "This is the Carolina breeze, and we need assistance." The feeding. Working the night shift at a diner isn't exactly glamorous, but it's honest work. The kind of work where the hours are long, the customers are rough around the edges, and the pay barely covers the rent. But it keeps you going, keeps you moving. My name is Eric Keaton, and for the past 6 months I've been working at Bobby's all-night diner, just off the highway that runs through Flagstaff. I'd landed the job after moving here to get away from some personal issues, trying to find a fresh start in the desert. It wasn't much, but it was a quiet place to clear my head and put some distance between me and my old life. But lately, things had been different. It started small, just the way these things do. Little signs that something wasn't right. A few weeks ago, we began noticing the smell. It was faint at first, like something spoiled, hidden behind the usual odors of greasy food and burnt coffee. We thought it was a dead animal caught in the walls or something, but no matter how hard we searched, we couldn't find the source. Then the customers started talking about it. It wasn't just a smell, it was a hunger. People would come in late at night, ravenous, ordering piles of food like they hadn't eaten in days. I'm talking about regulars who usually stopped in for a coffee and a slice of pie, now suddenly demanding burgers, steaks, fries, anything they could get their hands on. But no matter how much they ate, it never seemed to be enough. One night after closing up, I stayed late to clean up. The diner was empty, the only sound coming from the hum of the neon sign outside flickering in the darkness. I was wiping down the counter when I heard something. A rustling sound, like paper being crumpled, coming from the kitchen. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check it out, figuring it was just a rat or something. But when I opened the door, the smell hit me. It was stronger now, thick and overwhelming, like rot and decay. I shined the light around the kitchen, but everything looked normal until I saw the freezer. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for the stench to be pouring out. I approached it cautiously, my stomach churning as I reached out and pulled the door open. The light flickered, and for a second I thought I saw something. A shape. Something large, hunched over in the corner of the freezer. But when I blinked, it was gone. The freezer was empty except for a pile of raw meat that had been ripped apart, scattered across the floor. I slammed the door shut and backed out of the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild after a long shift. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next night, things got worse. It was around 2 a.m., the dead hour when the highway was quiet and the diner was nearly empty. Just a couple of truckers sitting in a booth, nursing their coffee. I was behind the counter when a man walked in. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were dirty, his hair a mess, and his eyes were sunken, hollow, like he'd been running from something. He walked up to the counter, his gaze locked on the menu hanging above my head. "You got any food left?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Yeah, kitchen's open," I said. "What can I get you?" He didn't answer at first, just stared at the menu, his lips twitching. Then he looked at me, and I'll never forget the look in his eyes. "I need meat," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Something raw. I can't—" He stopped, clutching his stomach. "I can't stop the hunger." I stepped back, my hand instinctively moving to the phone under the counter. "You okay, man? Maybe you should sit down." But before I could say anything else, he lunged across the counter, his hands grabbing the edges as he pulled himself toward me, his eyes wide with desperation. "Please," he gasped. "You don't understand. It's in me. It's in all of us." I froze, my mind racing as I tried to process what was happening. His grip on the counter was so tight his knuckles turned white, and I could see the veins in his arms bulging, his body trembling like he was fighting something inside himself. And then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. He let go of the counter, stumbling backward, his chest heaving as he fought to catch his breath. His eyes darted around the diner, and for a moment, I thought he was going to run. But instead, he collapsed. We called 911, but by the time the paramedics arrived, it was too late. The man was dead, his body cold, like he'd been drained of life. They took him away, said it was probably some kind of heart attack or drug overdose, but I knew better. Something was inside him, something that had been feeding on him, eating him alive from the inside out. I went back into the kitchen after the paramedics left, trying to make sense of what had just happened. That's when I noticed the freezer again. The door was open, wider this time, and the smell was back, stronger than ever. I grabbed a knife from the counter, my hands shaking as I approached the freezer. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I had to see. Inside, the raw meat was gone, every last scrap, but there was something else. Something scrawled on the inside of the freezer door in what looked like blood. "It's hungry. We all are." The next few days were a blur. The diner stayed open, customers kept coming in, but the hunger, it didn't stop. More and more people showed up late at night, their eyes glazed over, their bodies trembling with that same desperate need for food. And the freezer, it never stayed shut. No matter how many times I locked it, no matter how many times I cleaned it out, the door would always be open the next time I checked, the smell filling the air, the meat disappearing. I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. Whatever was happening, whatever had gotten into that diner, it wasn't going to stop. It was spreading. On my last night, I left a note for Bobby, the owner, telling him I couldn't work there anymore. I packed up my things, locked the doors, and drove away, leaving the diner behind me. But even now, as I sit here in a different town trying to forget, I can still feel it. That hunger, that insatiable gnawing hunger. And sometimes late at night when everything is quiet, I think I can hear it whispering to me, calling me back. The Collector. My name is Rick, and I've lived in Buffalo, New York my whole life. It's not the worst place to be, but there's a certain loneliness to it, especially in the winter. The snow piles up, burying the streets in white, making the city feel like it's on the edge of the world. I thought I knew this place. I thought I knew myself. Then, I met him. It started with a letter, handwritten, scrawled in ink that had smeared in places. The envelope was tucked into my mailbox between a pizza coupon and a utility bill. I almost missed it. The postmark was local, but there was no return address. Inside, the note was short, cryptic. I know who you are. Meet me at the place where things grow unwanted. Midnight. Bring nothing. I stared at the words, confused. There was no signature. I'd have dismissed it as a prank, but something about it unsettled me. The phrasing, the tone, the way it felt personal. I crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind kept drifting back to the letter. The place where things grow unwanted. It didn't make sense at first, but then it hit me. The landfill, on the outskirts of town where the city dumped its garbage. I hadn't thought about it in years, but as soon as the idea surfaced, I couldn't shake it. Against my better judgment, I got dressed and headed out. The landfill was worse than I remembered. A mountain of discarded junk and forgotten things, stretching as far as the eye could see. The cold night air bit into my skin as I parked the car, my breath fogging up the windshield. I stepped out, the stench of rotting waste filling my nostrils. I didn't know what I was expecting. Probably nothing. But then I saw him. Standing near a heap of rusted metal and broken furniture, just on the edge of the landfill, was a figure. Tall, wearing a long coat that billowed in the wind. He had his back to me, his head bowed like he was waiting for something, or someone. "Hey," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the silence. He didn't move. I approached slowly, my boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. As I got closer, I could see that something was wrong with him. His coat was patched together with scraps of mismatched fabric, and his skin, what little was visible, was pale. Too pale. "Are you the one who sent me the letter?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. He turned then, and I froze. His face, if you could call it that, wasn't human, not entirely. His features were distorted, stretched, as if someone had tried to mold flesh like clay and failed. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and black as coal. His mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin that didn't reach his eyes. "I've been waiting," he rasped, his voice thick, like it hadn't been used in years. I took a step back. "Who are you?" He tilted his head, considering me. "They call me the Collector." "The Collector?" I repeated, not understanding. "What do you want with me?" "You," he said simply. "You're one of them." "One of who?" He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, crumpled photograph. He handed it to me, and as I took it, I felt a strange chill run down my spine. It was a picture of my mother, from when she was young. I'd never seen this photo before, but I knew it was her. She was standing in front of an old house, smiling, her arm around a man I didn't recognize. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "The ones before you," the Collector said. "The ones that made you." I didn't understand. I looked at the photo again, my mind racing. How could he have this? Who was the man with my mother? And why did I feel like something about this picture was wrong? The Collector took a step closer, his grin widening. "They didn't tell you, did they? Didn't tell you what you really are?" I shook my head, backing away. "You're crazy. I don't know what you're talking about." "You will," he whispered. "Soon enough." Suddenly, the air around me felt thick, oppressive. The wind had stopped, and the world seemed to close in on me. I couldn't breathe. I turned and ran, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back. I sped home, the image of the Collector's twisted face burned into my mind. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every sound, Every creak of the house made me jump. The photo he'd given me was still in my pocket. I wanted to throw it away, but I couldn't bring myself to. The next morning, I went to see my mother. She was in a care home now, her memory fading more each day. I showed her the picture, hoping for some kind of explanation. Her eyes went wide as soon as she saw it. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Mom, who is this man?" I asked, pointing to the figure next to her. She didn't answer. Instead, she started shaking her head, her hands gripping the edges of her chair. "You shouldn't have come here," she muttered. "I told them not to tell you." I told them. "Told me what?" I demanded, panic rising in my chest. "Who is he?" But she wouldn't speak again. She just stared out the window, lost in some memory I couldn't follow. I left, more confused than ever. Over the next few days, I tried to forget, tried to put it all behind me, but the collector's words echoed in my head. "They didn't tell you what you are." What did that mean? Who was that man in the photo? Was it my father? Then the letter came again. This time it was just a single word. "Soon." I'm leaving Buffalo tonight. I don't know where I'll go, but I can't stay here. Not with him out there, watching, waiting. Because deep down, I know the truth now. I know that the collector isn't done with me, and whatever he's collecting, I'm next. Thanks for sticking around through all the twists and chills. If you made it this far, you've got a taste for the eerie just like us. Be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on the next round of dark and unsettling tales. And if you think you're brave enough, we'll see you in the next video. If you can handle it,